thank you, Sandra, for the invitation to speak to the group and to the Faust Branch for accepting her idea. I gratefully accepted the invitation, but it is a daunting topic and something that I feel is very important to get a hold of, but at the same time, the awareness about what the mystery of Whitsun really is has to be lived. And so what I'm going to share really is research that I've been doing, and I'm hoping that it will inspire conversation and question, and if necessary, criticism and correction if it's needed, because these are tender research ideas, and I tend to err on the side of too much information, so I apologize for that. I've tried to put it in digestible sections, and so we'll see how well I do by the time we get to the end of our evening. But in order to touch this idea about Rudolf Steiner's biography in relation to this mystery in particular, what inspires me right now in the research that I'm doing with the group that I study with comes from the book that Sergei Prokofiev wrote at the end of his life about Rudolf Steiner and the masters of esoteric Christianity. And in the course of this book, he's discussing Rudolf Steiner's successive incarnations. And in describing his incarnation as Thomas Aquinas, he shares that at the end of Thomas's life, he had a question that he was not fully able to answer. And that question had to do with how to unite what are described as two sources of truth. The one being the rational truth that is derived from human thinking, and the other would be described as revelation, which is imparted to the human being through the Gospels. And how could these two be united? And then Sergei Prokofiev goes on to quote Rudolf Steiner in saying that when Thomas Aquinas died with this question, that the question confronted world history at that moment. And so Thomas went across the threshold with this question about how to be able to unite the rational thought with the thought of revelation. How can these two things come together? And then Sergei Prokofiev says, this world historical question finds its answer in the spiritual science or science of the spirit founded in the 20th century by Rudolf Steiner, which he then describes as the science of the spirit of world Pentecost. So this is where this description came from that Sandra, when she asked me if I would give a talk, I said, well, I'd very much like to talk about this, although it's a daunting subject. And so this comes from Sergei Prokofiev's book, Rudolf Steiner and the Masters of Esoteric Christianity. So just so that you have a little bit of a background about where I got that idea. And so how things are going to progress tonight is that first I'm going to share a little bit of research about the search that I've been on for the cosmic signature of Rudolf Steiner's biography, both at his birth and his death. This is not going to be looking at charts and talking about astrophysical indications. It's more looking at the festival cycle of the year and how can we find a relationship to this idea of the spirit of world Pentecost. And then in the second part, and this may not seem like it will come at us as concretely as I'm describing it here, but just so that you have forewarning about that, I'm going to shift gears a couple times. Then I'm going to look specifically at a consideration of how ascension and Whitsun are informed by this cosmic signature of Rudolf Steiner's birth, and then what's happening with this specifically in 2021. And then if there's time at the very end, I would like to share some recent imaginations about the Whitsun mystery in the pre-Christian era, looking both at the Greek and the Egyptian. Okay, so with that, here we go. All right, so first and foremost, I would like to start with a quote from Rudolf Steiner about and I'm just going to apologize. I'm not used to working from notes, and I have these papers in my lap, and I apologize if you're hearing all that rustling. But in the small lecture that Rudolf Steiner gave, beautiful, beautiful lecture about the alphabet, he talks about the naming of an individual. And he says, in ancient days, men were instinctively aware that they brought a name down with them from the cosmos to the earth. And of course, he's done a beautiful description about the relationship to the physical form of the human body, to the fixed stars of the zodiac, and then also this in relationship to the consonants. And then he's given a description of the wandering stars, our planets, relative to the inner organism or the organs of the human being, and this in relationship to the vowels, which give motion to the consonants in our speaking. And so now he's speaking quite specifically out of this toward the name of an individual and what we are experiencing as we're incarnating, as we're coming down from the cosmos to the earth. And then he goes on to say that since then, Christian consciousness still preserves this primeval consciousness in an abstract way by consecrating individual days to the memory of saints who, rightly understood, should give new life to the spiritual cosmos. Now, in the original calendar of the soul, in addition to having the 52 weekly verses for meditation and the new images of the zodiac, there were names listed on each day. And this was meant to give this sense of what's sounding out in the spiritual cosmos of the earth every day. And you could say that every day that there's a saint ideally is an individual who has achieved something on behalf of humanity freely. And that when they cross the threshold into the spiritual world, that becomes available in the spiritual environment of the earth. And that when a soul is incarnating on a particular day that is named for a certain saint, that sounds out in the soul as they incarnate toward the earth. So then Rudolf Steiner goes on to say that by being born on a particular day of the year, we should receive the name of the saint whose day it is on the calendar. And what is meant to be expressed here in a more abstract way was more concretely expressed in primeval times when, in the mysteries, the cosmic name of a person was found in accordance with what he experienced as he descended to earth. All right, I put that accent there. I made that italicized because this is what I think is the most important in what I'm about to share, is that the cosmic name of a person is found to be in accordance with what the person experienced as they descended to the earth. When with his being, he created vowels with the planets and added them to the consonants of the zodiac. And again, this comes from the alphabet lecture by Rudolf Steiner. And so now we're going to look at his incarnation in particular to see if we can find a relationship to this statement about the cosmic name of an individual. And I'm not going to arrive at, oh, here's Rudolf Steiner's cosmic name. So just to make sure that nobody's waiting for me to give this big reveal, that's not what's going to happen. I just want to look at how is the life of Rudolf Steiner specifically related to the mystery of ascension and Whitsun and this spirit of world Pentecost that Sergei Prokofiev is pointing to. All right, so here's I wish I had a chalkboard so that I could actually draw this, but so I just used the little chalk feature that's on my keynote on my MacBook here, so bear with me. But so this is my very straight line. This is going to be a timeline, and I didn't measure things out, so it's also not going to be exact, but we're going to start first with the Feast of Matthias, which happens, did it show up there? Okay, the Feast of Matthias, which happens each year. I can't see how far that went. All right, on February 24th. All right, so in the alphabet lecture, Rudolf Steiner also describes that even when the church leaders and the calendar makers were not aware of it, that feast days were placed in the calendar by a higher wisdom. They don't just randomly pop up because somebody decided, oh, let's put that one right there. There's something guiding the placement of a feast day in the calendar. Now, Matthias is a very interesting individual in the mystery of Ascension and Whitsun because he's one of the few people that has participated with the apostles through the 3 and a third years of the teaching of the Christ. And after the ascension, he's one of the people that is gathered with the 11 apostles that remain. So we just have to take ourselves back to the events that happened during the Holy Week, where Judas commits the betrayal. And so he loses his position then as one of the 12 apostles. And there are only 11 apostles that go then through the crucifixion, the resurrection, the 40 days of teaching, and then the ascension. And so then these 11 are left at the ascension having to kind of out of freedom remember or figure out, decide what is it that they need to do. And so they've been left in complete freedom, and they realize, Peter begins to speak in the first chapter of the Acts of the Apostles, that they remember that they need to replace Judas because he gave up his bishopric with this deed that he did, this betrayal. And so they cast lots, and the lot falls to Matthias. So there's 2 men there. They pray over the lots. They ask God to guide them. They cast the lots, and Matthias is chosen. And the moment he is chosen, the very beginning of chapter 2, the Acts of the Apostles, it's described that they are in one place of one accord. So this is like an 11, they're all together. And when Matthias joins them and they become a 12 again, then the rushing winds and the flaming tongues of the Pentecost descend. This is the only place that Matthias shows up in the Bible. He's in Acts 1 and 2 of the Acts of the Apostles in the New Testament, and that's it. There's no story about where he came from ahead of time. There is some speculation about where he went afterward, but he's only described there. And his feast day was established in the 11th century in the Roman calendar, and it falls on the 24th of February. And in the 11th century, this was before the Gregorian calendar reform. So it was 6 days before the calends of March. So you start with March and back up 6 days and you arrive at February 24th. But if it's a leap year, then it would be on February 25th, which should be a familiar date to all of us because February 25th is the birth date of Rudolf Steiner. I can't see, Sandra, if the next line showed up. Are you seeing where it says Rudolf Steiner's birthday?
Not yet. We just see the Matthias line.
Okay, because I can't, there's everyone's lovely faces is over the right side of my screen and I just can't. Is it there? Okay.
Oh, there it is. There
all right. All right. So Rudolf Steiner was born on February 25th in 1861. So remembering what he said in the alphabet lecture about the cosmic name of an individual and that it can be related to what the individual is experiencing as they're descending toward the earth. And so just the day before Rudolf Steiner is born, the Feast of Matthias is occurring. And Matthias is this individual that is intimately connected to the mystery of the Pentecost. And his feast day is sitting over there in February, even though Pentecost happens in May, sometimes into June. And so he's not named Matthias, but just to have this sense that this high spiritual initiate that is incarnating through a spiritual environment that is resounding with the reality that was the reality of the community, the spiritual community that comes into being once Matthias is chosen to be membered with the 11 apostles. So this is sounding out in the spiritual environment as Rudolf Steiner is incarnating. Okay. So then he is baptized 2 days later on February 27th in 1861. Still can't see. So 9 months earlier, okay, so 9 months is the normal amount of time in a human gestation. 9 months before Rudolf Steiner's birth was actually Whitsun Day in 1860. So on May 27th, 1860 was Whitsun Day, and then 9 months later, Rudolf Steiner is born, and then he's baptized. So we have this really, I think, lovely gesture of a gestation that begins in this season when you could say it's almost as though the conception is occurring on the rushing winds and the flaming tongues of the Pentecost, which really starts to point to this idea that Sergei Prokofiev says about Rudolf Steiner, that in answer to the question of Thomas Aquinas, how do we join this rational thinking that the human being can arrive at through their thought processes with the revelation that comes through the Gospels, and that this question faces world history, and then Rudolf Steiner incarnates and answers this question through anthroposophy, and that this answer is what he describes as world Pentecost. So we have Rudolf Steiner being conceived around the time of Whitsun in 1860, and then he's born 9 months later, just one day after the Feast of Matthias, who's intimately connected to that mystery as well. And we can go a little bit further, pushing a little bit further into what might also be involved in setting up the incarnation of this particular individual. It seems very strange to say it that way. But that Ascension Day, obviously then in 1860, would have been 10 days earlier. So Ascension Day in 1860 was on May 17th. And it just so happens that Rudolf Steiner's parents, Johannes and Franziska, were married on May 16th. So they got married on the eve of Ascension. I just want to take a moment and acknowledge that although it's not the same date in the calendar, tonight is the eve of Ascension. So Johannes and Franziska, they were married the eve of Ascension, and then sometime during those few days there between Ascension and Whitsun, Rudolf Steiner would have been conceived, and 9 months later he's born at the time of the Feast of Matthias, and then he's baptized exactly 9 months to the day after Whitsun. And then taking a step a little bit further into this and asking the question, I feel like this is really sacred, and I'm speaking very quickly, but I just want to honor and acknowledge that we're looking at a very high spiritual initiate. And what I'm seeking is indication about the cosmic signature of this incarnation. And certainly it's all over the work and the deeds that Rudolf Steiner achieved in his life, but also we can find it in these, it's more than coincidence, this intention around the moment and the time of the birth. And so remembering that he's pointing out that the practice of naming a child according to the feast day that they're born on is calling forth a memory in the soul of what the individual experienced as they were descending through the spiritual world. So Rudolf Steiner's father, whose name was Johannes, was born on June 23rd in 1829. So he was born the day before the feast of St. John, and he's named John, who
Wow.
is a witness to a great mystery. And Rudolf Steiner's mother, Franziska, was born on May 8th in 1834, so 5 years later. And it just so happens that in 1834, May 8th was Ascension Day. So we have this really, really lovely, I think, very grace-filled gesture in the coming together of Johannes and Franziska and the conception of Rudolf Steiner at this time of this mystery of the rushing winds and the flaming tongues, and then the birth of this individual on the earth at the time of the feast of Matthias, and then his baptism just 2 days later, exactly 9 months after the Whitsun. And if I allow myself to step into an imagination around this, looking at the birth of Johannes close to the feast of St. John, then this calls forth the mystery of the witness, and that this is Rudolf Steiner's incarnation is really about witnessing the greatest mystery of this particular era in Earth evolution, which has to do with the etheric Christ. And the etheric Christ is something that we can experience because the mystery of ascension has been realized. The ascension of the Christ is protecting the etheric forces of the human body. And then 2,000 years later, we get to this reappearance of the Christ in that etheric, and Rudolf Steiner is the witness and the herald of that event. So I see in this particular arrangement of things around the time that Rudolf Steiner is incarnating a very strong support for what Sergei Prokofiev says about anthroposophy being the science of world Pentecost. All right. So I'm wanting to remind us that this 11 that Matthias is, when after the betrayal by Judas, this number 11 is really important as a prerequisite toward community building. And this is going to show up a little bit later. But just to point that out, just to put a little bookmark there, remember we've talked about 11 and we've talked about Matthias coming to answer the call to complete the community there. All right, so now I'm going to shift gears just a little bit, and I want to talk about something that I think it was already kind of percolating in me, but then in participating with the Western Regional Council's program last night, I was, when I woke up this morning, really inspired to share this part of this talk. And this has to do with our experience of the inner and outer etheric, which the first time I came upon this in reading the Easter lectures, the Easter festival and the evolution of the mystery, it was really confusing to me. I think if you think back with the first time you hear about an inner and an outer etheric, it seemed very, very strange to me. But in this particular quote, what Rudolf Steiner is describing is that the experience we have of the inner and the outer etheric can be connected to the phase of the moon. And that when we're at new moon phase, which we are right now, the moon was just new yesterday, that this is a time when the lunar forces are fashioning the inner etheric of the human being. And then 2 weeks later, when we come to full moon, we are having this experience of the outer etheric. So just to read this quote, in fashioning the outer side of the etheric body, human beings need forces of light. For in addition to other substances, the etheric body is composed primarily of the streaming light of the cosmos. Sunlight, however, is of no use for this. Sunlight cannot bestow the forces that enable human beings to shape their etheric bodies. To obtain these, we need the light that shines from the sun to the moon and is then reflected back. For in this process, the light is essentially changed. All the light we receive from the moon, the light that the moon sends out into the cosmos, contains the forces we need to form the outside of our etheric bodies. Conversely, the spiritual forces that radiate from the new moon are the ones we need to shape the inside of our etheric bodies. Thus, our ability to form the outside and inside of our etheric bodies is related to the moon's rhythmic alternation between light and darkness. All right, so this mystery of the etheric and our experience of the inner and outer etheric in relationship to the moon shows up quite beautifully in the calendar of the soul at this time of year. And this is the only time of year when it's really as accessible, because at other times of year, the relationship between sun and moon is not as exacting as it can be right now. So I think that we all know that the formula for determining the date of Easter every year is that you wait for the sun to come across the celestial equator, spring equinox, then you wait for the full moon, and then you find the first Sunday after that first full moon, and that will be Easter Sunday. So this has something to do then, because it's full moon, this has something to do with the outer etheric. And then we move to new moon, inner etheric, back to full moon, outer etheric. And then by the time we get 42 days down the road from that full moon, we're at the week when ascension will occur, and we're at new moon again, inner etheric. So we go from this experience of the outer etheric at the time of the Holy Week and Easter to the inner etheric at the time of ascension, which is where we are right now. So I'm going to show us how this pulses through the calendar of the soul verses, not every single one, but between Easter and ascension, just to get this sense of how we experience this inner and outer etheric, or how we can begin to contemplate it through the cycle of the year in relationship to the moon. So during the Holy Week, the full moon is always going to happen during the Holy Week. In 2021, the full moon happened on Palm Sunday. That's as early as it can happen. It can't happen the Saturday before. It's got to happen somewhere during that Holy Week, because the first Sunday after the first full moon is going to be Easter. So in this verse that we have for the Holy Week, it's verse 52 in the calendar of the soul. Not going to read out the whole thing, but what I want to point out is this description of wide expanses, heaven's distances. So we can imagine that this is a verse that is in reference to this outer etheric and the experience that we're having of the sun in relationship to the moon. And then 2 weeks later, we come to the new moon, and now we're dealing with the inner etheric. And now we have a reference to being fettered. I'm trying to free myself from fetters of my selfhood, so something within myself. So I've moved from this wide expanses and heaven's distances to an experience of something deep within myself. So I'm moving from outer etheric to inner etheric. And so this is still related to what's happening in relationship with the sun and the moon. And then moving 2 weeks later, we come back to full moon again. Now we're in the 40 days between Easter and ascension. So we've got this kind of this pulsing happening between the inner and the outer. We come back to full moon again. We get to verse 4, and now we're back at the sun illumined world and the floods of light. So somewhat like the wide expanses and heaven's distances, we can have this language of something that is expressing itself outwardly as the outer etheric. And then we get to the ascension verse 2 weeks later, where now we're back at new moon, and now we're dealing with the narrow limits within the self. So we have this sense of this outer etheric and this inner etheric, and then this outer etheric, and then this inner etheric. And then what starts to happen is the moon doesn't keep pace with the sun. They're not on the same rhythm. So the moon is not occurring at the same phase on the same day in the calendar from one year to the next. It takes 19 years for the moon to come back to being full on the same day in the calendar. And so what happens is we've got this harmonious relationship in the calendar of the soul verses relative to sun and moon and their relationship with this outer and inner etheric. And then that begins to shift. And what I heard Mickey say at the end of the presentation last night in anticipation of the next and third and final meeting with the Western region had to do with how the cycle of the year from Christmas time until the beginning of the summer, when we are experiencing the outbreathing of the earth's forces and we ourselves are also breathing out into cosmic spaces, that this is connected more to the forces of freedom, and that from the summertime back toward Christmas, then we are dealing with the forces of karmic necessity. And I think that it's possible to see that part of that is related to the fact that in the spring season and at the Easter tide, we have this relationship between sun and earth, or sun, earth, and moon, where the moon is operating in harmony with the sun, and then it kind of takes off on its own rhythm. And we don't find it anymore expressed the same way in the calendar of the soul verses. And then also, Rudolf Steiner makes a statement in his work on the human soul and the universe in lectures that were given in 1917 from Cosmic and Human Metamorphosis, that there are 3 encounters that we can have over the course of the human life. So during every 24-hour cycle, we have an experience of the angelic being. And around the Christmas time, he describes we have this experience, we can have an experience of the Christ being. And then once in every life, we have an encounter with the Father principle. But what I really want to point to is what happens in this description he gives about the opportunity to encounter the Christ around the time of Christmas, is that then he goes on to say that we have an opportunity then to be aware that the Christ walks with us from the Christmas time until Easter time. And that when we come to the Easter time, what happens is that the Christ being disappears, but he's disappearing into us. So he says quite literally, I'm going to read this quote, "For Easter is that season in the concrete course of the year in which all that is aroused in us by the meeting with Christ at Christmas really unites itself with our physical earthly manhood. The great mystery that now brings home to the human being the mystery of Golgotha at the Easter season, the Good Friday mystery, signifies, among other things, that the Christ, who, as it were, has been moving beside us at this season, comes still closer to us. Indeed, roughly speaking, in a sense, he disappears into us and permeates us so that he can remain with us during the season that follows the mystery of Golgotha, the season of summer, during which in the ancient mysteries men tried to unite themselves to John in a way that was not possible after the mystery of Golgotha." And so in trying to hold this imagination and this potential experience of the Christ disappearing into us at Easter, and then looking at the calendar of the soul verses related to this breathing out, or this expanding out with the etheric, and then coming within with the inner etheric, and back to the outer etheric, and then to the inner etheric, and then imagining what happens when we come to this ascension mystery, which will happen tomorrow. We have Ascension Day. And so the Ascension Day verse brings us to a union. So even though, excuse me, the Ascension Day verse is the one that we're at verse 6. The Whitsun verse brings us to a union. Now what happens is the moon, which is around new phase at Ascension. It's not always going to be new exactly on Ascension Day, but this week when we're usually reading verse 6, we're at new moon. And then Whitsun comes 10 days later. So the moon is going to be waxing toward full phase. So we're moving toward the outer etheric. And what's happening then is the necessity of uniting with something that's higher and greater. Now, in between verses 6 and 8, we come to verse 7, which I didn't put up here, but it's the Luciferic temptation verse, which has to do with it's myself as threatening to fly forth, lured strongly by the world's enticing light. So you can sense the Luciferic force in that. And so what I imagine is that once we've We've had the experience of outer etheric in the last week during the Holy Week. Then we come to the inner etheric, then the outer etheric, then the inner etheric, and then the Christ being ascends. And like the 11 apostles, we are left free. And what can happen in that moment is we can be carried away by the world's enticing light, but something has to be called forth. And that something is a gift from the Christ being that then allows us to actually experience the Whitsun mystery. And our knowledge of this in this time is really a gift that is coming out of the life and work and deeds of Rudolf Steiner, and is particularly described in the calendar of the soul. And it seems as though we are given an opportunity during this, really specifically the 40 days from Easter to Ascension, to kind of breathe with the outer and inner etheric. And then we have this ascension experience. And now for the 10 days from tomorrow, so tomorrow's the 13th until the 23rd, we are passing through this growing from inner etheric toward the outer, and having to pay attention to not being carried away by that Luciferic force. And then with verse 8, the Whitsun verse, the senses might grow strong, united with the God's creative work. It presses down my power of thinking into a dreamlike dullness. When godly being desires union with my soul, must human thinking in quiet dream life rest content. And this makes me think of the description that Rudolf Steiner gives about what happens to us when we are listening to the other, how we must fall asleep in our own thinking, so that something is speaking and sounding out to us from the spiritual world at Whitsun, and we must be still and allow that to sound in our being. All right, so now I'm going to shift gears again, and I want to remind us about this 11 that is represented by the being of Matthias, around whose feast day Rudolf Steiner was born. And so I've just included here the last part of the Acts of the Apostles. And they gave forth their lots, and the lot fell upon Matthias, and he was numbered with the 11 apostles. Now, it's the number 11 that's really important to me, because in addition to Rudolf Steiner being born at the time of the Feast of Matthias, the number 11 shows up quite uniquely at the end of his life and at the time of his death. And so to get there, I have to do a little bit of a setup. And so I'm going to be talking about both the tropical and the sidereal zodiac. So just bear with me. This little picture shows us the Earth at the center. And so it goes with the elements surrounding it. So fire, air, water, earth, and earth is the very center. And what I'm wanting to point out is you'll see the thick black line that says lunar sphere. So when we are on the Earth, we live within the lunar sphere, or you could say we live below the moon. We are in the sublunary world when we are moving around on the Earth in our day-wake, ordinary egoic consciousness. When we go to sleep, ideally we pass through the moon sphere, and then we're out into the celestial environment that is supralunary, so beyond the moon sphere. And so what I'm going to present to us is the idea that the tropical zodiac has to do with the experience of the ordinary egoic consciousness in the sublunary world, so within that circle of the moon sphere, and that the sidereal zodiac has to do with our higher nature, our star relationship and the star body. So they don't negate one another. What I'm always looking for is the relationship between them, and how can I and my consciousness move from the tropical to the sidereal. And it's a question that I have, and it's a research question. So I'm not saying that this is how it is. I'm just setting this up so that you'll understand what I'm about to describe. Because the first picture that I want to show us has to do with what was happening at the time that Rudolf Steiner died in the sublunary world, so below the moon sphere, in the physical body on the Earth. All right, so this has to do with the nodes of the moon. And so the nodes are 2 points in space. They're not objects, they're just points in space that are described by intersecting planes of orbit. So the Earth is going around the sun, and the moon is going around the Earth. And I'm doing it like this because they're not on the same plane. They cross at 2 points. And those 2 points are called the nodes. So the nodes of the moon, they have their own rhythm. They move in the opposite direction from the planets. when they're going direct. I'm happy to answer questions about them. Just bear with me. It's going to make sense in just a moment. So the symbol for the nodes look like these horseshoes. So the ascending node or the north node is open at the bottom. And so this is where the plane of the moon's orbit seems to rise up through the plane of Earth orbit. And then the descending node is just that symbol upside down. And that's where the plane of moon orbit is moving through the plane of the Earth's orbit. Now, when the moon is new or full, close to its node, because it's where the planes are aligned, then Earth and moon and sun will line up and we'll have an eclipse. Right, so that's coming toward us. We have an eclipse coming on May 26th and then again on June 10th. And this is because these two moons, when the moon is new and then when it's full, it's going to be very close to its own node. So we get this lineup and we have an eclipse. So eclipses happen in twice a year. There's 2 eclipse cycles because the moon is coming new and full close to its nodes twice each year. So at the time that Rudolf Steiner died, the node of the moon, I'm going to put a little arrow here so that you can see it, was at 11 degrees of Leo. This is in the tropical zodiac. So just looking in the sublunary world, where we are below the moon sphere in the day-wake egoic consciousness, using a division of the zodiac that is not based on what we actually see in the sky, but taking the 0 point as the day of spring equinox and counting 360 degrees from there, dividing that up according to a particular system in that zodiac. The node of the moon was at 11 degrees of Leo when Rudolf Steiner died. The south node was exactly opposite at 11 degrees of Aquarius. Okay, so here's this 11 sounding out. So 11 has this relationship, I believe, to the mystery of Matthias. It has to do with a would-be spiritual community that seeks completion. And so the 11 that go through the after the betrayal by Judas, they go through the crucifixion, they go through the resurrection, they go through the 40 days of teaching, they experience the ascension. At a certain point, Rudolf Steiner describes that after the ascension, they experience 10 days of despair because they feel that they've been left. And then out of themselves, they have to make a decision about the next action that they're going to take. And Matthias, as the individual that joins them to complete the community, is unique in the apostles and the apostleship because he's the only one that is chosen by his fellow human beings. The other 11 and even Saul, who becomes Paul, are called by the Christ being, but Matthias is called by his fellow human beings. So for me, this sounds out in what the kind of the mystery of what an 11 indicates. So Rudolf Steiner, when he died, the north node of the moon was 11 degrees of Leo. The south node of the moon was 11 degrees of Aquarius in the tropical zodiac. And so this is a picture of below the moon sphere. But we can dig a little bit further into this mystery of 11 and see that it shows up, I think, quite beautifully and really remarkably in Rudolf Steiner's deed and activity. And that, let me just get to the next screen. So again, we're looking at the nodes. Now we're going to look at the sidereal zodiac. So remember that picture I showed you? There was the black line that showed the moon sphere. The tropical was below the moon. The sidereal is beyond the moon sphere. So the picture that is created in the stars, in the sidereal zodiac, when Rudolf Steiner died, now the node of the moon, excuse me, at the Christmas conference, the node of the moon was at 11 degrees of Leo in the sidereal zodiac. So I hope that I didn't bungle that. I just want to repeat what I've just shown you. The first chart was when Rudolf Steiner died. The node of the moon in the sublunary world was 11 degrees of Leo. And if we go back a year and some to the closing of the Christmas conference in January of 1924, the node of the moon was at 11 degrees of Leo in the sidereal zodiac. So we have this 11 sounding out both tropically and sidereally, both in the sublunary world and the supralunary world. And you could say that in this supralunary world, in the sidereal zodiac, this 11, the node at 11 degrees is like a door opening in which an inscription is being made. So I look at the Christmas conference as this deed that Rudolf Steiner performs, inscribing something about the mystery of 11 into the spiritual cosmos. And then a year and a few months later, he dies when the node is at 11 degrees in the sublunary world. So 11 has about it this quality of a spiritual community that is not yet complete. And it seems to be of necessity that it is left unfinished so that we can show up to complete that community again and again and again. Rudolf Steiner describes how the Christmas conference should never be completed. It should continually be happening. And what he's doing at the Christmas conference is performing this sacred mystery rite of laying the foundation stone as a meditation into the hearts of the human being, that those that are both present and those who are aligned to this particular spiritual stream. And so what we see in this picture of the Christmas conference chart at the closing of the Christmas conference is that the node of the moon is at 11 degrees of Leo, and that in this superlunary world, we're dealing with the forces of freedom. In the sublunary world, we're dealing with the forces of karma and necessity. But the imagination that I have about this is that he's inscribed this deed freely into the spiritual world at the door that opens at the node, at this place where the plane of the moon and the earth orbits intersect, right at 11 degrees. And then a year and a few months later, he dies when the node comes to 11 degrees in the tropical. So it's like he dies young. He dies with, you could imagine that it seems like things are left undone. But it's of necessity that it's that way, because if everything was completed and everything was finished and all the questions were answered, there would be nothing for us to do and nothing for us to bring. And so I think that this sounds out to the cosmic signature of this particular incarnation and its relationship to the individual of Matthias, and how there's a deed and a gesture that completes a community, and that's kind of offered there, that each one of us can show up to complete the spiritual community. All right, so I feel like I'm saying a mouthful in that, and trying not to speak too fast. But also what I want to point out is that in the ancient astrological tradition, the region of Leo is always connected with the heart of the human being. And so when you think of the deed of the foundation stone and it being laid into the heart, that this is an inscription that's made both macrocosmically and microcosmically. And the foundation stone as a stone itself is a double dodecahedron. It's the dodecahedron of the microcosm and the dodecahedron of the macrocosm. And this meditation is as a bridge between them. And then the south node is over in Aquarius, which represents the future human being. So we're not living in the age of Aquarius yet. We have quite a ways to go to get there, but just that we've got this sounding out of the future human being and the forces of the heart in the position of the node at the time of the Christmas conference, and then also again at the time that Rudolf Steiner died. Okay, so there's a sacred inscription happening both in the stars and in the hearts of the members that are experiencing this sacred process. Okay, so I'm going to shift gears again. So I just wanted to say we had this idea of Rudolf Steiner's birth in relationship to Matthias. He's conceived at the time of Whitsun. He's born 9 months later at the feast of Matthias. And then also this idea about the sounding out of 11 in both the deed of the laying of the foundation stone and also in Rudolf Steiner's death. And now to get to what's happening this year and why 11 is sounding out so strongly for me, this has to do with the planet Saturn, which this is a photograph from the Cassini telescope. So this is actually a picture of Saturn. It's not just a graphic. So the planet Saturn just recently was in the news because of its great conjunction with Jupiter that happened at winter solstice. But Saturn is now visible for us in the morning sky. It's not as bright as Jupiter, but Saturn takes about 28 years to complete its orbit of the sun. And since ancient times, in the ancient astrology, it's been related to father time. And you could say quite superficially that when you just look into the night sky, you can't see the planets Uranus or Neptune or the dwarf planet Pluto with the naked eye, but you can see Saturn. Saturn is the furthest planet from us that we can see with the naked eye. But prior to the use of the telescope, it was not necessarily, the astronomers were not always just trying to measure the distances of things, but looking at the rhythm of motion through time. Saturn is moving the slowest. It takes the longest to complete its orbit. So it seems to follow that this one would then mark the boundary of time. So Saturn has this relationship with time. And then this year in 2021, Saturn is going to make three motions across 11 degrees of Aquarius in the zodiac, which you'll remember from both of the pictures of the charts that I showed you was the position of the South Node. So the position of the South Node at 11 degrees of Aquarius, when Rudolf Steiner died, is what's sounding out in the motion of Saturn this year. So Saturn first moved across 11 degrees of Aquarius in the tropical zodiac, in the sublunary world, in our day-wake consciousness with our ordinary ego, from March 28th, which was Palm Sunday, until April 9th. And so you'll note that that included Palm Sunday. It included the anniversary of Rudolf Steiner's death. It also, included all of the Holy Week and Easter. Now, Saturn moved on, and then it's going to come to its station and turn retrograde when it appears to us to be moving backward against the stars. And that's going to happen in July. Saturn is going to move over the 11th degree of Aquarius a second time. And this will be from July 8th until the 22nd. And right after Saturn is finished doing that, the moon is going to come full. The moon will be full on July 23rd in the summer this year. I've written July 24th there. It's actually July 23rd. And it will be at 1 degree of Aquarius. So this just puts it 1 degree off the position of Saturn and Jupiter when they came to their great conjunction at winter solstice. Okay, so what this says to me is, all right, these two great planets met about 6 months ago, and the impulse, the energy of that meeting is now being reflected by the moon toward us on this full moon 6 months later, when that moon occurs in the same region of the sky where the great conjunction happened. So this is what I'm looking for. When we get to this time, Saturn has gone a second time over 11 degrees of Aquarius, and now the moon is going to become full at the great conjunction point. It makes me want to look back and see, what was I doing back there during that time? What has happened since that time? Can I begin to see what's sounding out in this great meeting that's taking place? How is this potentially related to the life and to the deed of Rudolf Steiner that's completed or fulfilled, you could say, when he dies, even though it looks as though the deed is undone. It's left undone so that we can rise up to not necessarily complete it, to close it, but carry it on. And then the moon, then Saturn is going to come after it makes its retrograde stations, turns direct again, and it will go over 11 degrees of Aquarius a third time. And that will be on December 24th until January 1st, which makes it exactly coincidence with the dates of the Christmas conference. So there's something really strong sounding out in this position of Saturn. It's just completed its meeting with Jupiter, and it's moving 3 times over 11 degrees of Aquarius, which was the position of the South Node when Rudolf Steiner died. I think I should also qualify it astrologically that the South Node is usually interpreted as this kind of door through which we bring those things with us that we must meet out of karmic necessity in our destiny path when we are born. And that when a planet comes conjunct the South Node, it's as though you're given I guess I'll say a second chance. It's like you're given a foundation to stand on to complete something. So Saturn sounding out at the 11th degree of Aquarius 3 times in 2021 is really, for me, drawing attention to the life and deed of Rudolf Steiner. Now, I'm also going to own my bias in that direction. And I know that I'm speaking to a group of anthroposophists, so I'm not pretending to have objectivity about it. But hopefully at this point, I've demonstrated that there's a very clear connection, at least for me, between the mystery of Matthias and the experience of the Ascension and the Whitsun and the incarnation of Rudolf Steiner, and trying to get back to what Prokofiev is talking about when he speaks about spiritual science as the spirit of world Pentecost, and Rudolf Steiner's deed in relationship to that mystery, both to bear witness to the reappearance of the Christ in the Etheric, which is intimately connected with the Ascension mystery, and then giving us this, well, I would say in a very comforting way, the information, the path, the knowledge about how to come to an experience of the Whitsun mystery. Okay, now, one last thing, and then hopefully I've left enough time for us to ask questions. Hopefully there will be questions. And so this just occurred to me the other day. And it's interesting when I am asked a question or asked to give a presentation, I have to listen to what follows on that because I think, like all of us, researching all the time. And it's very interesting what starts to show itself, in particularly when you're not looking for it. But so because we're coming up to the mystery of the Whitsun, I wanted to share what presented itself as, I think, a very lovely imagination about the rushing winds of the Pentecost and how they blow the flames of love into the midst, where it is cloaked in the rhythm of time, bestowing speech on human beings. And so this is really touching very lightly on what in part was being discussed last night about this relationship between space and time, that something is being blown out of space into time. And that before we get to the Christian era and the experience of this is the imagination that came to me the other morning when I was thinking about this. When I woke up, usually this is a picture of the ascension that is usually what we're seeing is the Madonna is there and the apostles around her and the descent of the flaming tongues. And there's this awe that's happening in this moment. But what occurred to me is that in the pre-Christian era, it's possible that the description of the birth of Venus was also kind of like code speak for something that was coming. And what we see in this image now, of course, this was not painted in the pre-Christian era. This is Botticelli's Birth of Venus that's painted in the Renaissance. But what we see here on the left side is the Zephyrus and Chloris. And so these would be representing the rushing winds, blowing this flame of love into an experience on the earth. It's as though she has been immersed in the sea and then symbolically resurrects. And standing on the right-hand side is one of the Horae, which is also referred to as one of the hours, to receive her in time. So we have this experience of something that is being blown out, the rushing winds of the Pentecost, you could say, blowing the flames of love into the midst, where it is cloaked in the rhythm of time. And that out of this then rises the capacity for speaking from the heart. Venus is always connected to love and beauty. So you could say that she's representing the love that's coming in, that's rushing in on the winds of the Pentecost. And then also, Rudolf Steiner describes how Whitsun is preeminently a festival of flowers. And so you'll notice on the left side of this image, the flowers that are falling through the sky with the winds that are coming toward Venus. Now, it's also sometimes described that one of the beings, the being with the red hair that's hanging on to Zephyrus, that's Chloris, that she's a flower nymph out of Greek mythology. But it's quite possible that the birth of Venus is the description of a stage of preparing for realizing the Pentecost. So the birth of love and beauty, an ability to witness and to realize this. When we look at the chemical wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz on day 5, he sees Venus. It seems to be somehow related to a mystery of the mystery of how we begin to experience community. So the birth of love and beauty within the self, strengthening our capacity to speak from the heart. And then going further back in time into the ancient Egyptian era, this is the house shrine of Akhenaten. Akhenaten is there seated on the left, and his wife Nefertiti is seated on the right. And this is usually dated around 1350 BC when how this house shrine is dated. And oftentimes it's described that the three beings that accompany Akhenaten and Nefertiti are their daughters. But I'm not an archaeologist, but I have a different imagination about what these beings represent. And I think that what we're looking at is an attempt to describe a spiritual mystery and to give form to spiritual beings. And the way this first occurred to me is in looking at the being that is standing over the left shoulder of Nefertiti. And she has her arm right up through the throat larynx region of Nefertiti. And one could imagine, so in addition to the fact that the name Nefertiti means the beautiful one who came, she's also the lady of two lands, which suggests to me that she's both of this world and the other world. But if you look closely at that being, she's positioned right over the left shoulder. Now, during the Egyptian era, the point of vernal equinox happened when the sun was crossing the celestial equator in front of the stars of Taurus. And so we have this sacredness of the bull, but in the region of Taurus, the left shoulder is where we find the star cluster of the Pleiades. And so the Pleiades would represent that left shoulder. And the brightest star in that star cluster has the name Alcyon. Alcyon means foundation stone. So we have this small being that's standing over the left shoulder of Nefertiti, and she's making this gesture as though she's drawing down the larynx into Nefertiti, like an organ that's coming into being. And if you look closely, now I am not a eurythmist, but what she seems to be, the gesture she seems to be making to me is the gesture for Venus. And so just as we could imagine in the Greek era, the birth of Venus has to do with this capacity for speaking that is later realized in the Pentecost, I imagine that this is also being depicted here in this image of Nefertiti, where this being is drawing down the larynx and is doing it in the gesture of Venus. And then when you look on the left of this image, we see Akhenaten, and he's holding one in his arms. And it looks like, they don't look like babies, but he's also, it looks like he's kind of receiving a magical breath of holiness. There's a breathing happening between them. So it's as though he's being given the word and she's being given the organ that will speak that word. And then these scarf-like figures that are behind their necks, I'm imagining that as though it's the wind. This is the breath of God that's going to give them the capacity for speech once this organ is realized in their being. And then the third figure that's sitting on Nefertiti's knee, again, this is just my imagination, but she seems to be uniting the two of them, the male and the female, together in this co-creative process of speaking the sacred word. And this is happening, this image is being depicted in the third post-Atlantean epic, which our fifth post-Atlantean epic would mirror. And so you could say that there's a precedent here for how one begins to speak from the heart, to speak from this foundation stone of love. There's something that's happening in this imagination here that I think is kind of a setup for what will can later be realized in the fifth post-Atlantean epic. And I feel like I've just said a very big thing, but I do believe that there's a deep mystery going on in this house shrine. And it's more than that they are being depicted as a cute couple with children bouncing on their knees, which was not like any other Egyptian art that was happening prior to that time. And also, just to quote from Rudolf Steiner about the mystery of the larynx as an organ in the human being relative to our speaking, that he describes how through our hearts we make ourselves human, but through our larynx, the macrocosm makes us human, and that we are linked to the macrocosm through our larynx. So this gift of speech is something that I think is being depicted in this image. It has very much to do with love and with beauty, and it also has to do with its relationship to the heart. That figure over Nefertiti's shoulder is in the position of Alcyon and standing at the heart of Nefertiti, and her name means the beautiful one who came. So we have the birth of Venus, goddess of love and beauty. We have Nefertiti, whose name means the beautiful one who came. And then we also have the being of Anthroposophia, through whom and through which we receive our very own being. And Rudolf Steiner describes how this once floated toward us in the form of a celestial goddess with whom we were able to enter into relationship. This divine being lived on as Sophia and Philosophia, and now we can once again bring her out of ourselves and place her before us as the fruit of true anthroposophical self-knowledge. So I was just sharing with you this research imagination that I'm having about the birth of Venus as a preparation for an experience of Pentecost, and how we also see this in the house shrine of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, and this mystery of the larynx as an organ in the human being for being able to speak the language of the heart, which is deeply connected to what happens in the Whitsun mystery. Okay, take a breath. And I do have I'll just show you very quickly that what you can see, if I haven't talked over it tonight, this is an image from Sky and Telescope, and you'll see down on the bottom right corner the moon and Venus. So the moon was just new yesterday. So it's just the thin sliver of moon right next to Venus. And then tomorrow night, Ascension Day, after the evening of Ascension, we're going to see the moon right between the cow's horns and next to Mercury. So a lot of mystery going on in the sky right now, but this is something that's visible to us if you have a clear sky about half an hour, 45 minutes after sunset.